So as you, sorry about that. As you might have noticed, there's a long list of people that we're going to present, and due to a variety of complications around travel and why we're all wearing masks, several of them aren't here. So if this is a little more disjointed than you might want, I do apologize for that, and I'm happy to answer more questions around this. But this is really about moving past some of the work that I've been doing for the past 4 years on topological data science and cartographic methods to represent and work on districting questions. And this is Alexis Wood. I'm Jim Thatcher. And so first, I'm going to give you a very brief demonstration sort of gerrymandering. We're going to talk about finding and defining communities of interest, which is a term that's really important, and we're going to use as sort of the crux to show where and how cartography runs into limits and questions around representation. And then we're going to sort of talk about cartography's role in interdisciplinary works, seeing these lines, pushing limits thereof. And finally, we're going to conclude with this push towards translational science beyond the Cartesian grid, which aligns really nicely with some of the work that actually Nick just showed. So hooray. There's nothing about ethics in here though, so sorry. So this all comes out of this REU site that I've been running from 2019 to 2022. We've decided to cycle it down. And it was a intentionally interdisciplinary approach. So it was the senior research team came from math, computer science. There's a data scientist from Microsoft, critical human geography, cartography, which I made nicely bold, and GIS, which we can talk about if those are different if you want, but we can do that another time. Today, we're going to talk about communities of interest and the limits of how we represent them. Right, so I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time here, but every 10 years, the US conducts a census because our Constitution says we have to. Different actors draw lines in different states, which is where this gets kind of winky, is, you have legislatures in some states, independent commissions in others, courts get involved often. Sometimes special masters get appointed, which is a fantastic title that someday I hope to hold. Laws across the states differ broadly. And so the outcomes will also differ broadly as well. And the kind of approach that we start from is that all districts are gerrymanders, right? Because maps are how we make claims on the world, right? This is coming from the perspective of critical cartography. And our project begins with the assumption that all districts are gerrymandered. We don't have a ton of time to go into extreme detail, but I'm happy to explain that, and I've also written about that elsewhere. But the point is that there's no perfect district, right? Lines on a map are necessarily acts of inclusion and exclusion. This is the fundamental act of what districting is. And in some sense, I would suggest mapping in general. To draw a line, to mark something as present or absent, to draw a boundary between people who get to vote in this area and people who don't. So if you start to think about it like this, and you accept that there's no correct district, that these are all socio-political constructions through which we organize our government and resources. And perhaps there are more ethical ways to do it, and perhaps there are ways that we can agree socially. See, I worked ethics in for you. There are perhaps ways we can agree socially that something is fair. But the point is that we get towards something that we agree on, not that there's something that just is. And here, with that sort of setup, I'm going to turn it over to the brilliant Alexis Wood.
Hello, everyone. I just want to quickly give some context with communities of interest. The things that I'm about to tell you sort of come from 6 months of experience of processing 9,000 community of interest maps from this last cycle by hand. So I have seen all 9,000 publicly available communities of interest maps in the US. Okay, so within the processes of redistricting, there have been multiple criteria defined throughout the cycles to guide this agreement on what is fair. Some of these are more empirical than others, and some are considered more important to achieving and maintaining this fairness than others. Some of these are more empirical, and important criteria include equal population, racial equity, and maintaining contiguous compact districts. On the other hand, we have ones that are not particularly easy to quantify, such as making sure the redistricting process retains the core of a previous district, deep philosophical problem I don't want to touch on, or the retention of communities of interest. One way that we can make claims towards fair districts is through the somewhat nebulous concept of communities of interest. So much like the rules of districting in general, there's quite a lot of variance in respect to what it exactly is a community of interest. However, according to the National Conference of State Legislators, 27 states include some notion of preserving communities of interest when districting. Of course, how does one go about this, and what exactly the communities entail is vague and often contradictory. California has one of the most precise definitions written into their state constitution, and it's worth quoting. A community of interest is a contiguous population which shares common social and economic interests that should be included within a single district for the purposes of its effective and fair representation. Examples of such shared interests are those common to an urban area, a rural area, an industrial area, or an agricultural area, and those common to areas in which people share similar living standards, use the same transportation facilities, have similar work opportunities, or have access to the same media of communication relevant to the election process. Communities of interest shall not include relationships with political parties, incumbents, or political candidates. So in discussions concerning communities of interest, it is often noted that these are units which should at least partially be determined by those who live within them. This has given rise to various mapping platforms such as Representable and Districtor, which allow users to create maps of what they consider to be their own community of shared interest. A few issues emerged in the analysis of the data collected by these platforms. Most notably, people have very different situated understandings of what makes a community, and in this, what should constitute a community of interest. For the testimony given in the example, this is a community which centers around attending events not in Bakersfield. Descriptions like this were quite normal throughout the COI processing. Some of this is a miscommunication of what exactly can count as a community of interest within the current guidelines, but it also indicates that we, referring mostly to political institutions, are probably not thinking broadly enough. I would also like to note that within these mapping platforms, the user must draw their communities within pre-existing boundaries as defined by the US Census. If your community of interest only covers parts of these predefined boundaries, there are no options to only select half or 1/8 of the census boundary. One way of addressing the gap between expected COI maps outputs and what is actually produced by the community is approaching their identification in a different way. You're looking at the output of the mapper algorithm, a particular technique of topological data analysis which allows the user to see structures within the data provided. Provided demographic data are now nodes in this graph clustered by their relationship to one another. And then if we zoom into cluster 3, which is right up at the top, this is what we end up with. Cluster 3 falls into a single node that holds just over 55,000 people in population, more rural, more white, wealthier, educated, and have a higher percentage of children living at home. This is a possible community of interest, but one that is split in a way which does not allow them to be considered together. Even when exclusively considering the data and the political body is envisioning, we run into this issue, an inability for outputs produced by both community and the algorithm to conform to a standard required by legislation. Both of these concepts, community mapping and using the brute force of computation, have been presented as straightforward, sleek, and efficient ways to produce a community of interest, but run into the same problems which can be distilled down to the production of the map itself. This is even without mentioning the ethical issues that we run into only when considering the data collected by the census. Data, no matter its thoroughness, is still an abstraction, and it's not what makes the individual and not what constitutes a community. Not the point of the talk, but ethics.
If you want to see these maps and other ones around them, these are from a 2020 piece that we have out that I'm happy to give you the reference to, it's in a math journal, so it's probably not on your radar otherwise.
So with that, we begin to see a tension between idea and practice, communities of interest, which in theory would allow those who are not considered explicitly in the political process, communities bound by religious beliefs, communities with similar economic interests, communities of a particular ethnic background, able to retain voting power through the institution of a COI against what can actually exist within the current political system. With the push to collect communities of interest, this redistricting cycle, what we have actually achieved is a reinforcement of power in those communities which never needed extra support in the first place. These are all highly visible communities which are already defined by census data within the provided standard cartographic boundaries. See cluster 3 as an example. A great idea in theory, but restrained by legislative definition, created with the bounds of divisions of space, which in itself has been created and reproduced by the cartographic standard.
And this sort of brings us back to kind of the role that we found cartography playing in these processes as we were doing these analyses. And I think this is true more broadly. It's been true in a lot of the interdisciplinary cartographic work I've done at least, but perhaps, some people have different experiences. But I find that cartography is often reduced to two viewed as important, but I think reductive roles, right? One is data preparation and correction. So one of the main things that we discovered, and this is hugely important, right? One of the main things that we discovered is that if you're pulling in data from different scales, they won't perfectly match up. So let's say, for example, one way you can look at districting is to see how many times, say, an existing county boundary is cut up by a legislative district, right? You can count mismatches between different social organizational forms. But if, for example, your county data is just 10 meters off where your census districting data is, that's going to count as a cut, whether it actually exists in sort of reality, as we walk, reality is the wrong word, walking aroundness or not. And then, you also have what data format does this need have to be, right? As we run processes that are pulling together things from computer science and data science and then trying to spit them out into QGIS, you have to know what you're doing to do that. And the other is, of course, the final presentation and communication. Make that look pretty. And I think that's something that most of us in this room actually are adept at and also enjoy. That's one of my favorite parts about mapping, but it's not all that there is, right? These are presented as perfunctory and straightforward, but they're not at all. They're deeply ontological in nature. And here I like to refer to this Bruce Braun quote from 1988 symposium in the Annals of the AAG, where he writes that all ontological claims involve a certain epistemic violence, a closing off that is at once necessary and a problematic condition of knowledge production. And what I want to call for coming out of this work and all of the work around districting, which I have really enjoyed doing in some ways, is that we need pathways to recognize these limits of representation. And to do that, we have to push beyond the Cartesian plane of data cleaning and clear communication of that map communication model that Nick so wonderfully threw up on his slide, which derives from, the popularity of cybernetics at the time, but in part. So as we start to recognize that, these communities of interest aren't going to fit into contiguous compact shapes. And then we have to ask ourselves, okay, well, then what's got to give, right? Is it the concept of this way that we're defining or exploring communities of interest? Is it this way that we're drawing our voting districts? Is it the nature of the fact that this line has to be contiguous in order to be represented? Or is it something else? And that's an open question, and I was really, really happy to follow up Nick, because I think a lot of his work is pushing at those limits. A lot of Clancy's work is pushing at it. I think I saw Luke Bergman in the back also, and I'm sure there are a bunch of you that I don't know that are also asking these questions, and I would love to hear more about them. So thank you very much. I do apologize that COVID, some people couldn't make it, so we're a little less complete, but I'm happy to field questions, and I think we have some time for it.